Howdy folks, welcome back to the Conspiracy Farm. Today we're going to talk about MK Ultra. MK Ultra was the code name for a top secret CIA program, and the stated goal of this program was to control the human mind. The CIA wanted to know, how do you brainwash people? How do you force prisoners to reveal their secrets? How do you program people to become assassins against their will? Well, this program was all about learning how to do such things, and the tools that they used included hypnosis, good old-fashioned torture, and most of all, psychedelic drugs. This program lasted for 20 years. In the decades that followed the shutdown of MK Ultra, it's been proven that thousands of citizens were unknowingly affected and hundreds were deliberately dosed with experimental drugs, sometimes against their will. And sometimes prisoners volunteered to take the drugs in exchange for clemency, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about all the details of the program that we know, and then we'll play a special game based on a famous person connected with the MK Ultra program. It's a game called Explain Charles Manson, but that's for later on in the episode. I first mentioned MK Ultra in Meet the Aliens Volume 2, and I proposed that a major part of the motivation for creating Project MK Ultra was attempting to get to the bottom of psionics research. Sure, the CIA, the deep state, our normal government, we're all concerned about recent major espionage successes of the Soviets. In 1952, the Soviets detonated a hydrogen bomb, and this caught the CIA completely by surprise. The Soviets were able to put together their own version of the thermonuclear bomb much more quickly than had been anticipated. Also in 1952, there was a major UFO flap, as they called it, over Washington, D.C. It was very similar to what happened at the end of 2024 in the New Jersey area, and you can look up photos of this. People didn't have smartphones in their pockets back in 1952. However, there were so many of them and they were there for so long that we did get some photographs of what was going on. And so MK Ultra was started in 1953, and according to its official records, this was simply a response to how successful the Soviets had been in their espionage program. However, when you look at the focus and the techniques of MK Ultra, it seems a little strange. If you're worried about Soviet spies smuggling out physics secrets or engineering plans to the Soviet Unions to help their nuclear weapons program, it seems strange to plant spies in large social gatherings and then dosing everyone in the building with LSD against their will. I get the distinct impression that they were not being entirely upfront with the full extent of the problem they were trying to solve. Believe it or not. While I was researching MK Ultra, did I come across any hints or tips or life hacks to help brainwash people or make them do things against their will using subliminal mind control techniques? No, unfortunately, I'm just going to have to develop an audience the old-fashioned way. I would never trick my audience like that. That would be a pretty rotten thing to do. I mean, you're sitting here listening to a podcast, trying to relax, and then someone's trying to inject weird information into your brain to make you do things against your will. It's just awful.
And obey Vincent. Vincent is your God. I am your God. Obey me.
So MK Ultra appears to have been structured so that handlers from the intelligence community would make contacts either with test subjects or with actual medical research organizations, like Harvard University, for example, to inject people with drugs and then do experiments on them, usually involving having them perform some mental task. So the goal was to get a variety of test subjects injected with strange unknown drugs. Based on the descriptions of their effects, they were clearly some form of psychedelic drug, usually specifically referred to as LSD, although, who knows, was it really exactly LSD? We don't know. What did MK Ultra do? Did they put ads in papers asking for people who thought they had psychic powers to step forward so they could be tested? Kind of, yeah. We know that they focused a lot on the use of psychedelics and developing pharmaceutical methods or hypnosis methods to control people's thoughts or memories. Also, developing pharmaceutical tools or hypnotic tools to force people to divulge information against their will. We'll never know the full extent of MKUltra's research because in 1973, all MKUltra records were destroyed by the explicit order of CIA Director Richard Helms. So it's been very difficult for people to get a complete understanding of what's going on with MKUltra and what they were doing. But here's my thought. They always say follow the money. And the story we've always heard about MKUltra is that it was overreach by cold warriors trying to one-up the Soviets in the field of espionage. But what if there was a monetary reason for the sloppy risk-taking and the money expenditures? And of course, this monetary reason would have to be something beyond national defense. We've been told the intelligence community was just trying to defend the country. But what if the intelligence community was feeling some kind of pressure to crack the code of psionics, so to speak, so that maybe some of this knowledge could be used to access recovered alien technology and also possibly prepare defenses against mind control from NHI or Soviets who learned it from the NHI? Bear in mind that the intelligence community and the criminal underworld go together like chocolate and peanut butter. It's kind of a convergent cultural evolution, because both the intelligence community and the criminal underworld require secrecy, both internally and against the external world. They're both brutally hierarchical, and they are both highly exploitative by nature, meaning they're built like pyramid schemes. And that means that they both have a constant need for disposable, desperate people who will do extreme things, and then they can either be simply killed and not be missed, or if they can't be killed easily, then they can just be discredited. So, hippie folk singers who moonlight as pimps and killers for hire are a great source of new recruits that can be severed the same way a lizard could drop its tail to evade a predator. It's especially easy to recruit hippie folk singers and pimps and killers if you tell them that a big part of the experiment will be taking massive amounts of drugs. And from what we can gather, one of the early enthusiastic recruits for the MKUltra program was a young man named Charles Manson. Charles Manson clearly had some experience with this kind of psionic research, and we'll listen to some of his wisdom later on and try to decode what he's talking about. Let's talk about another famous participant in the MKUltra program, Ted Kaczynski, more famously known as the Unabomber. He was responsible for the death of 3 people and seriously injuring 23 others between 1978 and 1995. And as you may recall, he would simply mail bombs to people. And he targeted people based on his fear of technology and how technology would destroy us and the environment. He wrote a huge, long manifesto. It was called Industrial Society and Its Future. He's essentially a Luddite. Basically, he was convinced that most technology was essentially evil and debilitating, and that humans would become less and less self-sufficient and would lose their purpose or moral grounding. In 1979, Kaczynski had the dubious honor of having triggered the most expensive manhunt in FBI history. Finally, in 1998, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was diagnosed with cancer in 2023, and he hanged himself a few months later. So, a sad death to a sad life. 2 other famous participants were Sirhan, the man who gunned down Robert Kennedy, also Ken Kesey, the author who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is a fascinating and well-written book, and the movie is beautiful and heartbreaking. I couldn't recommend it more. Ken Kesey never murdered anyone or did anything evil that I know of. He wrote some great stuff, so more power to you, Ken. Not too many of us can say that they let the deep state inject them with experimental drugs, and then you turned around and wrote a great novel. So, well played. As I said, in 1973, the records for MK were destroyed, but so much money had been spent and there were so many people blowing whistles about the strange things that were going on that Congress itself in the late 70s had to deal with the rumors and talk about the program publicly. And so this following clip is word for word from a transcript of a hearing in 1977. And this is what Ted Kennedy said on the Senate floor in 1977. And of course, you know it's true because Ted Kennedy said so. Let's listen.
The deputy director of the CIA revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program, which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels. Several of these tests involved the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects in social situations. At least one death, that of Dr. Frank Olson, resulted from these activities. The agency itself acknowledged that these tests made little scientific sense, and that the agents doing the monitoring were not qualified scientific observers.
I think the most important statement in that last clip was the following. These tests made little scientific sense. Oh, I bet they didn't. At least not to human scientists in the 20th century. Let's also note that MK was formed in 1953, but it was built out of some existing programs. One was started in 1950, and it was called Project Bluebird. There's that color blue again. Remember, there is a rumor that in the 20th century, it has since been abandoned, but there was a practice of using the word blue in code names that referred to super top secret stuff, i.e. NHI-related material. So maybe in 1950, they were already seeing that using the word blue was a little too obvious. And so in 1951, Project Bluebird was renamed Project Artichoke. Now, what was the purpose of Bluebird and Artichoke, and why was it lumped into MK Ultra? Well, as far as we can tell, the purpose was, quote, to study mind control, interrogation, behavior modification, and related topics. And related topics? What does that mean? You can't start off with mind control and interrogation and behavior modification and then jump to related topics. That's like reading a job description that says, duties include sweeping the walkway, performing brain surgery, and related duties as assigned. At that point, that can mean anything. So since the late 1970s, various journalists have done their best to try to sketch a picture of what MK Ultra was doing. And also get a sense of why were they so interested in LSD? Why were they interested in young people? Females, children, and people on the autism spectrum in particular. Let's listen to one researcher sum up what she found out, especially people like Ted Kaczynski.
A considerable amount of credible circumstantial evidence suggests that Theodore Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, participated in CIA-sponsored MK-Ultra experiments conducted at Harvard University from the fall of 1959 through the spring of 1962. Because most MK-Ultra records were deliberately destroyed in 1973 by order of then CIA Director Richard Helms, it has been difficult, if not impossible, for investigators to gain a complete understanding of the more than 150 individually funded research subprojects sponsored by MKUltra and related CIA programs. Beginning at the age of 16, Kaczynski participated, along with 21 other undergraduate students, in the Harvard experiments, which have been described as, quote, disturbing and ethically indefensible.
It's one thing for a university to conduct experiments using psychedelic drugs. Why would you involve a 16-year-old person? And remember that this psionic research tended to target people who were younger, women, and, as I said, people on the autism spectrum in particular. And in particular, they were concerned about the effects that LSD had on certain individuals. Among the stated goals in the few MKUltra documents that were recovered, they stated that their goals were to develop, quote, materials and physical methods which will produce amnesia for events preceding and during their use, end quote. I think it's interesting that our intelligence community was very convinced for some reason that you could induce amnesia and control people's minds and gather intelligence just using the power of one's consciousness. That's kind of a stretch. I don't know. One explanation may have been just the CIA directors were watching a few too many wild 1950s science fiction horror movies. Or was there a real horror movie going on underground in New Mexico at the time, with alien subjects being interrogated? I think the focus on LSD and other psychedelics is very telling, because one thing that seems to have been observed in people who follow mystical practices and in people who follow ufology and maybe other woo-woo type subjects is that psychedelics have the apparent ability to suppress the part of the brain that produces the illusion of self. So, let me repeat that. Apparently, substances like LSD, they do a lot of things to the brain. But one thing that they do is they shut down the one part of your brain that's designed to create the illusion that you are you and not just part of the universe. Turns out that organisms that fully experience their connection to the universe don't do anything, because why would you? It turns out that the kind of consciousness that we have is sort of self-contained. It's very, we're stuck in a universe of our own, basically. And LSD and DMT and certain other drugs have an ability to sort of pop that balloon, to break that illusion and allow you to see the universe unfiltered by self. Now, I've never experienced this. Got to admit, I'm curious. But people who have done massive amounts of these drugs seem to agree that this is something that happens. Now, when you reduce that illusion of self and you make your consciousness more fully in line with the actual broader universe, well, then you can perceive this psionic field much better. Your psychic abilities dramatically improve. Now, in these documents, when they talk about producing amnesia or controlling minds, they state that the supposed motivation for this was the need to get ahead of the Soviets and North Koreans in terms of their mind control techniques in order to win the Cold War and prevent some sort of espionage-related disaster. Let's wrap up this discussion of MKUltra by talking about another wonderful young gentleman named Whitey Bulger. Now, Whitey Bulger was a lifelong organized crime boss. He grew up in South Boston, and like many times in his life, he ended up being an inmate. And while he was serving prison time in 1957 in Atlanta, Georgia, in a federal prison, he volunteered for an experiment in exchange for a reduced sentence. So what did Mr. Bulger have to do to participate in this experiment? Well, it was simple. He was led into a room, injected with a drug, and then left in the room to deal with it. He was told that this was a drug that would help find a cure for schizophrenia. So the CIA scientists brought Mr. Bulger into a room strapped him to a gurney, injected him with a drug, locked the door, and let the experiment proceed. Luckily, Mr. Bulger recorded his experiences, and here's a quote where he describes the experience of being on these drugs.
Total loss of appetite. Hallucinating. The room would change shape. Hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares. And even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning to skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane.
All right, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like a cure for schizophrenia. That sounds like the opposite. They're definitely on the wrong track there. Those darn government scientists, the CIA hired the lowest bidder to make that drug. So after Whitey Bulger had all this fun, he was finally released from prison, where he went back to work as a crime boss in Boston and also an FBI informant. And the FBI helped him out. In fact, there were times when the DEA was about to come down on him like a ton of bricks, and the FBI helped him escape. For example, whenever the DEA would successfully bug one of his workplaces, the FBI would make sure and let Whitey Bulger know that the bugs were there so that he could escape accountability. As you can see, Whitey Bulger seems to have had a lifelong relationship with the intelligence community. And as I said, he's the perfect person for the intelligence community. He's extremely connected, has a lot of intelligence and initiative, but he's also a brutal psychopath who's willing to do almost anything, and who has zero credit with the general public. I mean, he's an underworld crime boss, murderer, scammer. Who's going to listen to him? But you can still have too big of a mouth. Bulger was on a manhunt and supposedly eluded the FBI for years and years and years. He was finally arrested, put back in a federal prison. He started talking about spilling the beans, writing a big book. Started talking about all the stuff he could testify to given his long, corrupt relationship with the federal government. And so he was beaten to death in 2018. The supposed reason was because when it was all out in the open that Bulger had been an FBI informant, he was killed because he was a rat. That seems a little late on the timeline for gangland vengeance. If he had been an FBI informant since the 20th century, 2018 seems a little late to finally get his comeuppance. And now it's time for everyone's favorite game show, Explain Charles Manson. Charles Manson was famously convicted for the murders of Sharon Tate, her unborn child, and Leno and Rosina LaBianca in the late 1970s by the prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi. And these people were brutally murdered with knives, and Sharon Tate was more than 8 months pregnant, and her child died as a result. Now, here's the thing. Charles Manson was not there. He was not on the scene. It was a very unusual prosecution because Bugliosi had to prove to the jury that Manson had sort of brainwashed his followers into doing this, that they were carrying out his exact instructions. And so it's a very strange kind of prosecution when you're pointing to the person at the defendant table and saying, yeah, I know he wasn't there. He wasn't even in the house. He never held a knife, never held a gun. He never even met these people, but he did it. He's guilty. So now, is Charles Manson probably a murderer? Sure. I mean, he's clearly a terrible person, a manipulative cult leader type person who just uses people for his own aggrandizement. The one thing I'll say about Charles Manson is he is extremely charismatic, and I can see why people might fall under his spell, especially sad, hopeless, impoverished vagabonds in the late 1960s. And so Charles Manson is not a good person, but he's not as insane as people think he is. That's my main thesis here. It's not only the case that a lot of things he says do relate back possibly to things he may have learned or encountered during his time with MK Ultra, or it's also the case that a lot of his sayings are just generally true, but not things people want to acknowledge. So what we do in this game is we listen to quotes from Charles Manson, and then I'll explain what he's actually trying to say. What is the wisdom behind these extreme words? People generally think of Charles Manson as crazy, but if you take the time and really read between the lines, you'll find that he has some cogent, responsible, and important things to say about society. We're going to start off with our longest quote, and this one just gives you a sense of Mr. Manson's oeuvre. It gives you a sense of the kind of guy he is, his overall vibe. I mean, he's a rock and roll dude. He's from the streets. He doesn't have time for intellectuals like me and my fancy computers. So let's hear what a real man of the world has to say. Are you ready, Charles? Here he comes. The Ayatollah of rock and rolla, Charles Manson. Go ahead, Chuck. Cook for us.
I don't want to take my time going to work. I got a motorcycle. And a sleeping bag. And 10 or 15 girls. What the hell I want to go off and work for? Work for what? Money? Huh. I got all the money in the world, baby. I'm the king, man. I run the underworld, guy. I decide who does what and where. What am I gonna run around like some teeny bopper somewhere for someone else's money? I make the money, man. I roll the nickels. I deal the cards. The game is mine.
Please explain Manson now.
Okay, well, I think it's pretty clear what he's trying to say here. We live in a culture where the vagabonds, the pimps, the intelligence agents, the handsome men on parole who can write catchy songs, these are the people who are controlling the minds of the youth. So why bother starting a bank when you can plant seeds of culture? Manson was actually warning us a bit about the counterculture. In other words, if young men have a choice between hard work and responsibility and family versus 15 girls and a motorcycle, which one are they going to pick? And you can't have a society if too many people pick option B. So score one for Manson. Good job, Chuck. What's our next bit of wisdom? What's our next quote? Let's see. Let's listen.
You know, a long time ago, being crazy meant something. Nowadays, everybody's crazy.
Please explain.
Okay. So to understand this one, you gotta go back and put yourself in the early 1960s, back when crazy was a thing. It was a thing that people could be. And Manson is basically lamenting the fact that the intelligence community has to murder people a lot more often now because it's harder to discredit people for being crazy, because everybody's crazy. Doing or saying strange things no longer exempts you from participating in our culture or our power structures anymore. So it used to be something special, to be someone like Charles Manson that the intelligence community could use and then point at and say, whoa, check out this guy, he's nuts. Now you got to have the strontium-90 bullets and all the other crazy ways of getting rid of crazy people. So I think that's what Charles Manson is talking about here. Good point, Chuck. He's making sense, guys. Our society has so degraded our mental health that our mental health standards are no longer what they once were. Now, let's hear the next one.
You look down at me, and you see a fool. Look up at me, and you see a god. Look straight at me, and you see yourself.
Explain. What did he mean by that, Vincent?
Okay, I got this. So your perception of people... So what Manson is saying here is that your perception of people like him... Manson is suggesting... I think here Manson is suggesting that your perception of people like him says a lot about what you are. If you look at him as a scumbag criminal, then you make yourself God because you're judging him. You're putting yourself above him. Now, if you look at him like he's a god, then is he suggesting here that you're the scumbag criminal? In other words, maybe you shouldn't do that. Some people might think, oh, he's saying that if you look up at him, you'll see a god because he's God. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think that he says that God is anything you do look up to. That if you look up to anything, that becomes your God. Then Manson says if you look at him on his level, then you'll realize that you are on his level. In other words, neither one of you is a criminal and neither one of you is a god. Does that work? Yes. Nice. Okay. All right. Let's go for number 4. What's number 4?
These children that come at you with knives, they're your children, not mine. You taught them. I didn't teach them nothing. I just tried to help them stand up.
What did Charles Manson mean by that, Vincent?
Okay, this one's pretty easy. Manson is basically saying that the murderous young people that he sent to kill those people late at night in 1969, those people were made violent by the media and the culture that they grew up in. That all Charles Manson did was point them in a particular direction. He showed them how to express their violence and rage, but he's saying that these kids were already full of violence and rage and they just needed a place to put it. And when he says, I just tried to help them stand up, I think that hints to the fact that the reason why young people followed him and wanted to do these terrible things for him was because he promised them a kind of empowerment. He promised them a way to take over the culture and change the world to make it more the way the counterculture wanted it. They didn't want to just hold picket signs and march. They wanted to smear blood on the walls and go nuts. Manson is trying to tell us, look, these people wanted to do that before I even met them. Don't blame it all on me. So what do we think? Does that work? All right. Ready for number 5.
Total paranoia is just total awareness, man.
What did he mean by that, Vincent?
Aha. Okay. This one points directly to his experiences with LSD and with this thing we're calling the self and how it's constructed in the brain. So, I admit, this is a tough one, but bear with me. So total awareness would be the experience of having no self. It would be viewing no difference between yourself and the rest of the universe. And people who do meditation or remote viewing are familiar with this kind of experience. Now, he's saying that there's a connection between this and paranoia. Now, you guys might be excited to find out that paranoia is essentially ancient Greek for overthinking. And so you're just finding too many patterns and too many plots in all the noise of everyday life. And if you were aware of every thought and every plot, you'd have quite a busy mind yourself. You would seem to be a little scattered and disengaged and seeing things that ordinary people don't. And so they think you're just nuts. So what's going on here is Manson is showing that Manson is explaining how what a lot of people would call insanity or a lack of mental health is really just understanding better how the world works. That the more you understand about the world and the more you know, the more insane you sound. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. Hey, I like that idea. I like it. Let's bring on number 6.
In my mind's eye, my thoughts, like fires in your cities.
Please explain.
Uh-huh. See, you probably think that that's a tough one. You probably think you got me there. But you'd be wrong. To the uninitiated, one might think this is just some insane rant of a dangerous, crazy person who's trying to scare you. But that's where you'd be wrong. Mr. Manson here is simply alluding to the power of consciousness itself, which he explored as a test subject in the 1960s. So just like CIA remote viewers can detect alien bases underground on the other side of the world, Charles Manson is wisely explaining to us that a person's intent and their consciousness can physically affect the world. And this is something that he learned. Does that work? Sound good? All right, I'm unstoppable. On a roll. Lucky number 7, let's go.
No sense makes sense.
Why, whatever did Charles Manson mean by that, Vincent?
Okay, Manson is trying to explain that what we think of as reality is just like a he's saying that if you're like wanting to make sense of the universe, then what you bring to the table in terms of your preconceived notions and perceptions don't always apply to the. So when you're everyone has their own philosophy about how they okay, fine, you're yeah, fuck it, you're on your own with that one. I don't know. We're all on our own with that one. Maybe that's what he's saying. Is that what he's saying? Everything makes sense to somebody. Makes sense to me. So, all right, 6 out of 7. I did pretty good. I'm the current world heavyweight champion of Explain Charles Manson. Well, Whitey Bulger outlived Charles Manson by 1 year. As I said earlier, Bulger was killed in prison in 2018. Charles Manson died of colon cancer in 2017. I've been stressing my pet theory that MK Ultra was primarily a response to deep state contact with NHI, But even if we suppose that it really was just a response to recent Soviet successes in espionage, it's important to remember and consider this program because it gives us a clear picture of what a powerful government is willing to do when it feels threatened, when it feels like it has its back against the wall. Aliens don't have to be involved for us to see the panic. I think the deep state psychologists and psychiatrists were in over their heads. And when you look at the contemporaneous state of psychology and psychiatry at the time, in the 1950s and 1960s, our understanding of the brain at the time was nothing to write home about. Still isn't, but it was even worse back then. So it's interesting to consider that MK Ultra was launched 10 years after the Manhattan Project. So first we have a massive government effort to build the first atomic bomb. And then 10 years later, we have a massive government effort to control the human mind. Seems like they should have done the first part first. They got things a bit out of order. It seems like if you find yourself in the middle of a world full of violent, crazy people, you'd want to look into mind control before you built a bomb that could destroy an entire city, but could fit inside the back of a pickup truck. It's fitting to see MK Ultra then as a part of a secret arms race of the mind. That was an arms race that was every bit as cutthroat and epic as the arms race that involved nuclear weapons. MK Ultra is also physical proof that the human mind is ultimately the deep state's biggest fear. They don't control us through brute force. There's not enough of them. They can't fight out in the open with us, toe-to-toe. So they control us through understanding our minds. As I said earlier, the program was exposed and shut down in 1973, but it wasn't because someone grew a conscience and thought better of it. I think after 20 years of fumbling, the deep state realized that the 20th century was a sad joke for psychiatry, and their experiments with psychedelics and meditation had exposed some very bizarre and dangerous capabilities in these little pinkish-gray blobs we call brains. And they've been terrified ever since. Note how much more subtle the intelligence community became starting in the 1980s. We had some exceptions. Some things still leaked out, like the way we were torturing people at Abu Ghraib prison during the Iraq War. But we haven't had an intelligence community outing quite like MK Ultra in 1974. And I can't help but wonder, what are they working on now? Maybe nothing. Maybe they already learned everything they need to know. Of course, we'll talk more about all this stuff, but for now, I want to leave you with this question. How do you think you've been influenced? What was the most effective ad campaign that you could remember? Bear in mind that if you can remember the ad campaign, it probably didn't have the maximum impact on you. The ad campaign that changed your life was probably one you don't even remember. What was that song that stuck in your head and you couldn't understand why? Did it make you feel an urge to do something you ordinarily wouldn't? I remember one time when I was in middle school and there was a party. Everybody was having a lot of fun. And this song came on, and it had a really great beat. And I just felt this urge, in my body that I wanted to get up, get on the dance floor and show my moves, And so I got out there and I started dancing, and I was having a blast, and everybody was clapping, cheering me on. And it was like I could see the Matrix. I could see the dance moves out in front of me, and I was nailing it, right? Everybody was getting served. And then it occurred to me. The CIA was doing it again. MK Ultra. The CIA was playing me like a fiddle, having me hop around like a pathetic marionette on a string. And then, for the first time, on that dance floor, I said to myself, "Not today, CIA." And to this day, every morning, before I go out to work, to face the world, to risk being influenced, I look in the mirror, and I look myself dead in the eye, and I say, "Not today, CIA." And when I was young, I'd run my hand through my hair when I said it, with a snarl on my lips, kind of like Billy Idol. And I wish I had this on video so I could show you, but unfortunately, even if this were on video, I couldn't show you now because I'm bald. So, not today, CIA. And so, until next time, remember, no fun, no music, no dancing. Definitely no dancing. You never know when they're trying to control you. Stay safe. Talk to you later.